Hi guys. As you can see, it's gone dark. I've had to put my light on and I'm getting tired, so my glasses have gone on as well. Okay, so the last bit that I read was that when he changed into what becomes Mr. Hyde, he feels sweet, younger, lighter, happier. There's a heady recklessness, as if he feels he can just get away with whatever he wants. And yet, even in that first moment, he knew that it was not an innocent freedom of the soul. It's almost like he was selling himself to something worse. So he knew that there was not an innocence to it. He could feel how evil it was. He goes on to say that, I knew myself the first breath of this new life to be more wicked, tenfold more wicked, sold a slave to my original evil. That whole line needs to be highlighted, and I would put that into either your Jekyll page. If that's getting too full, either just get another bit of paper and put it on, or put it into one of the theme sections. I'm sure there's one about... might be one about sin. It's a good one. Maybe you could put that one in sin. I don't know. The other bit that I wanted to pick up from the last couple of lines that I read that I didn't really get to talk about in the end of the last video. After the selling sold a slave to my original evil, the thought in that moment braced and delighted me like wine. So he's admitting that he felt suddenly 10 times more evil and it delighted him like wine. Now the simile to delight like wine is quite interesting because getting drunk is not a thing that one should be proud of, and it means that you lose your inhibitions and you might do things that you wouldn't normally do, so get more aggressive or whatever. And yet there's a kind of buzz that you get from the alcohol, which is why humans do it, and it's a really interesting contradiction that he's talking there. So I've actually circled the simile and put it braced and delighted me like wine, so it's kind of like it gives him a buzz even though he knows it's bad for him and that he shouldn't be doing it. Okay. I also would pick out when he says, I stretched out my hands, exulting in the freshness of these sensations, and in the act I was suddenly aware I had lost in stature. So exulting is feeling great happiness and joy. Again, it's a word I tend to associate with religion. And when he says lost in stature, it means he's suddenly shrunk. He's not as tall and big as he was before. And that's a really interesting thing with Mr. Hyde. We've noticed that all the way through people have described him as pale and dwarfish, and he's very small. And his height and stature has been something that people have talked about regularly. And I think symbolically what Stevenson, the writer, is trying to project as an image of Hyde is that because we do all have an ego and a superego, we don't allow our id out very often. We shouldn't, if you're a son, you never let him out, ever. But the idea is that it's a bit like a muscle. If you have a muscle that you don't use, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller and it can waste away. But if you use a muscle and you use it repeatedly and you keep using it, it will grow and get bigger. So really interesting that as we go through this chapter and when we look back on the chapters before, the reason when he's wearing the clothes that are too big for him is because he quite literally doesn't fit into Henry Jekyll's clothes because he's physically smaller, because there's less of him, because there was less of him because in civilized society we have to keep our ids to ourselves. Okay, so I'm going to carry on then. I'm on page 44 in this book, and it's after the last bit that I read at the end of the last video that I did. There was no mirror at that date in my room. That which stands beside me as I write was brought here later on, and for the very purpose of those transformations. So in the bit where Utterson and Poole bust into the laboratory thing, they make reference to, why is there this big mirror stood here? Well, now we know that he didn't have the mirror to start with, but he brought the mirror in so that he could see himself. That night, however, was far gone into the morning. The morning, black as it was nearly ripe for the conception of the day. The inmates of my house were locked in the most rigorous hours of slumber, and I determined, flushed as I was with hope and triumph, please highlight those two words, to venture in my new shape as far as to my bedroom. I crossed the yard, wherein the constellations looked down upon me. I could have thought with wonder, the first creature of that sort, that their unsleeping vigilance had yet disclosed to them. I stole through the corridors, a stranger in my own house, and coming to my room, I saw for the first time the appearance of Edward Hyde. Ba, ba, ba. Oh my God. So, when he takes the potion for the first time, he doesn't know what he looks like, he hasn't got a mirror. He sneaks from his laboratory through the little yard thing that he's got that's kind of in the middle of his house, and then into the bit that Jekyll lives in, hoping that no one sees him. Luckily it's like the early hours of the morning, so everyone's asleep, and he sneaks up to Jekyll's bedroom and looks at himself. So that's quite a risk that he takes in that very first time, and he doesn't do it very often. But yeah, he sneaks up and he sees for the very first time Edward Hyde. I must here speak by theory alone, saying not that which I know, but that which I suppose to be most probable. and I've highlighted this next bit, the evil side of my nature, to which I had now transferred the stamping efficacy, was less robust and less developed than the good which I had just opposed. So I've highlighted up to there. Again, in the course of my life, which had been, after all, 9/10 a life of effort, virtue and control, it had been much less exercised and much less exhausted. And hence, as I think it came about, that Edward Hyde was so much smaller, slighter and younger than Henry Jekyll. Even as good shone upon the countenance of the one, evil was written broadly and plainly on the face of the other. Evil besides, which I must still believe to be the lethal side of man, please highlight that, had left on that body an imprint of deformity and decay. I've written here to learn, had left on the body an imprint of deformity and decay. And the word deformity has been used repeatedly, hasn't it? It's like other people can't quite explain what's wrong with him. And we now know it's because he's pure evil. And mankind has never ever seen anybody that's pure evil. Because all humans are both things. Some will be more evil than others, but they will always have a bit of good in them. So really good people have a tiny bit bad, and then you've got everything on the spectrum right up to people that are really bad, but they'll probably still have some good in them somewhere. Whatever. He's the first creature to ever walk the earth as pure evil in a human body. So that's pretty terrifying for a Victorian audience. And to me, and you know I'm an atheist, but the concept of that, if that were to be real, is really terrifying. And it kind of makes me realise that when everyone else is trying to describe him, it's because we are kind of animals ourselves and we have this sixth sense. You know how animals can kind of sense fear and things like that? It's like the other humans could sense the evil, that he wasn't like them, that he was pure evil. And I think when we go back and look at some of the chapters, you can see that's what Stevenson was hinting at when they tried to describe him. Okay. And yet, when I looked upon that ugly idol in the glass, I was conscious of no repugnance, rather of a leap of welcome. So ugly idol meaning something that you worship. So not quite it's more of a juxtaposition than an oxymoron there, but an idol is something you worship and he's describing it as hideous. Ugly. And yet he personally sees a leap of welcome. This too was myself. It seemed natural and human. I've highlighted that and I've put that on my Jekyll page. In my eyes, it bore a livelier image of the spirit. It seemed more express and single than the imperfect and divided countenance I had been hitherto accustomed to call mine. So actually, he prefers being just the one thing. It's a lot easier than having the two things to try and do together. And in so far as I was doubtless right, I have observed that when I wore the semblance of Edward Hyde, none could come near to me at first without a visible misgiving of the flesh. So this is him describing every time somebody came near him, they all kind of went, ooh, like almost involuntarily. This, as I take it, was because, highlight, all human beings, as we meet them, are commingled out of good and evil, and Edward Hyde, alone in the ranks of mankind, was pure evil. So that line where it says, Edward Hyde, alone in the ranks of mankind, was pure evil, you need to learn that. Particularly the alone in the ranks of mankind, like if that's the only bit you can remember, go for that bit. Because as I've just said to you, he's never existed before. Pure evil has never existed before, ever. I've got a scar here and it's starting to be really noticeable because I've got the light in my laptop over here. I'm going to just dim that. Very conscious of it. I got bitten by a dog in my 20s. Anyway. I'm on 8 minutes. Right, I've got a few more minutes. I'm going to do another paragraph and then stop for the evening. I lingered but a moment at the mirror. The second and conclusive experiment had yet to be attempted. It yet remained to be seen if I had lost my identity beyond redemption, and must flee before daylight from a house that was no longer mine. And hurrying back to my cabinet, I once more prepared and drank the cup, once more suffered the pangs of dissolution, and came to myself once more with the character, the stature, and the face of Henry Jekyll. So he panics for a moment. He's like, right, okay, all very well, I feel great, I'm now pure evil, this feels better than trying to be two things in one, but what if I'm stuck like this? Runs back, takes the potion, yay, he hasn't lost his identity beyond redemption. The word redemption is also religious, the idea that you can redeem yourself in the eyes of God. He comes back to that concept towards the end, and we'll need to talk about that quite a lot at the ending. That night I'd come to the fatal crossroads. Please circle and highlight that. Crossroads meaning a decision that he had to make. Had I approached my discovery in a more noble spirit, had I risked the experiment while under the empire of generous or pious aspirations, all must have been otherwise. And from these agonies of death and birth, I had come forth an angel instead of a fiend. The drug had no discriminating action. It was neither diabolical nor divine, but it shook the doors of the prison house of my disposition. And, like the captives of Philippi, That which stood within ran forth. At that time my virtue slumbered. My evil, kept awake by ambition, was alert and swift to seize the occasion, and the thing that was projected was Edward Hyde. Hence, although I had now 2 characters as well as 2 appearances, one was wholly evil, and the other was still the old Henry Jekyll, that incongruous compound of whose reformation improvement I had already learned to despair. The movement was thus wholly towards the worse. So what he's explaining here, I've highlighted things like angel or fiend, again, very religious, and he's saying that basically if I'd been in a better frame of mind, if I'd been in a different place in my life, then possibly I wouldn't have gone down the route that I went down. However, he says that my virtue slumbered, so his goodness, his virtue, slept. His evil kept it awake by ambition, so he's excited at the possibilities of Edward Hyde. So the problem he's got now is that when he's Hyde, he's pure evil, but when he's Jekyll, he's not pure good. He's still both things. So he hasn't really got what he wanted out of the situation, because if he could be all evil and then all good, he would feel good about that. But actually, the problem is when he's Jekyll, he still feels torn. And that's not a fun feeling, so it naturally pushes him towards the Edward Hyde, because that's a better feeling. To be just all one thing is nothing's at war. There's no shipwreck. There's no, what was the other word he used for it? I can't remember. The struggle. Yeah, it talks about the struggle and the war, doesn't it? There's no struggle with Hyde. He's just evil. So when he says the movement was thus wholly towards the worst, I've highlighted that, and that is the key point there, that he's telling the person that's reading the statement of the case that he was naturally more drawn to be Edward Hyde because it was just easier than being Jekyll. And it was more fun. Right, guys, I'm going to sign off for the evening. I hope that this helps you. I feel like I've been slightly more scatty as the weeks of lockdown have gone on. So I'm sorry about that, but I'm hoping that it's helping. If it's not, if this is really rubbish, then just don't listen to my videos and just read the book yourself. Have a look on SparkNotes. You can always get your chapter summaries from there. Please make sure you are doing chapter summaries. You can even summarise the little bits, like after you've listened to these 3 parts, summarise what we've learnt so far. When we get back to school, which who knows when that's going to be, according to Boris tonight, we might not see each other till September, which is mental. I'm hoping that I'll see year 10 before then. We will need to go back over bits of it, but I won't be able to redo the whole novel word for word with you all. Okay, guys. Bye. I haven't got anything else to say.